thank you very much for your interest in relational peace building. We had an excellent time yesterday in the context of another meeting, the meeting of the Relational Thinking Network. And so we're able to share some of the work that we've been doing on relational peace building. So to those who were in those discussions, which I have to say were very rich, our apologies if we go over some of the same ground. But what we thought we would do today is for me to start with since I've had more than my share of airtime, a very brief introduction, then to hand to Jeremy to describe a little how we have come to a particular contribution in the peace building space. So he'll describe that. And then we've invited, at very short notice, our friend Valery Morozov, who is our advisor on global affairs, really, to...
I got promotion.
Exactly. There's no more money in it, don't worry about it. But to be able to look at some of the dimensions or dynamics of relational peace building in the contexts in which we're working, to which we're often blind as people coming from particular cultural bias. So we're hoping that with 3 short presentations, since we only have less than an hour for this session, that we would then have an opportunity to discuss. So by way of very quick introduction, my own background is in international relations and then in international development. And in both of those contexts, the idea of peace building, either conflict resolution or negotiation or community-based development, has been a strong theme. So for me, relational peace building is not another product line, because our approach to peace building brings the best of relational thinking in all of the dimensions in which it can be applied, because our interest is in building societies that will prosper, and they will prosper only on the basis of equitable, sustainable relationships. So in embracing relational peace building initiatives, which is the successor to a prior history of 20 or 30 years, RPI was established as an association under Swiss law at the beginning of last year, only in Geneva. But as Jeremy will explain, it has antecedents which have led us to where we are. But from that time, we've been looking at our entry points to global discussions around peace building from that more comprehensive and fully integrated perspective. Not just the techniques of peace building, because we can all complete our various courses on tools and techniques, but really looking at it in a much more holistic view. Second comment to make from the Geneva perspective, in all of the dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are just a handy reference tool really to capture the range of global issues linked to sustainability, to inequality, to the climate change agenda. For the years of experience that I've had negotiating technical or financial fixes, I've come, perhaps too late, but certainly to the very profound conclusion that if we're not dealing in equal measure with the relationships, then our efforts to propose more technologically appropriate or more efficient techniques is not going to be successful in the longer term. So in Geneva, we've been taking opportunities to introduce other peace-building organizations to the notion of a relational approach. We have had specific country situations, both in the past where RPI has documented its experience, its learning, which includes, of course, things that didn't work, so that can also be shared with the peace-building constituency at large. But we have had specific country situations where the experience that has been gathered over the years is now being applied. For the first 18 months of my engagement, we were mostly looking at the situation in Ukraine and trying to understand the various parties to the differences of view in that situation, but more importantly, looking at ways that we could encourage some of the key players to imagine alternatives to continuation of violent conflict. We were also looking at the situation in Korea and had developed over time, Jeremy and Valerie and others, Michael Schluter before me, contacts who were open to discussions around a relational approach to the situation on the Korean peninsula. More recently, there's been a revival of interest from colleagues in South Africa, but also in Nairobi. There are other situations in Africa which invite the same kind of attention. And of course, we would not have to go far to look at the Middle East, to conflict situations even in our own environments that could easily be addressed. So I wanted just to emphasize that from my perspective, RPI sits under the panoply of relational thinking, but it is actually a connector, because depending on the situation, we are able to take the relational approach to discuss economy or environment or the role of church communities or other faith communities, always from a relational perspective. So let me end with that brief introduction and hand to Jeremy, who will describe a little bit the history, but perhaps more the methodology of specifically what RPI does. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. Yesterday I was tracing out the methodology which we used in the context of South Africa, which ran from 1986 until 1991 in a series of consultations, starting by looking at the alternative possibilities for constitutional settlement in South Africa, looking systematically at all the different areas which would need to be taken into account in a future settlement in that country. Trying to get beyond the divides and in fact drawing people from across the divides specifically into a safe environment. So it was a small select group of people brought to a neutral setting, invited in their personal capacities with people who had close and influential roles in the different groupings that there were, who could talk freely and come to an understanding of the situation together and share their perspectives and together build on a common framework, which we now call the relational framework. We didn't at that stage call it that, but we now see it very much in terms of the relational framework. I think implicitly we're doing it, but now explicitly it's been elaborated. And then later on, from 94 to 99 in Rwanda, and then from 99 to 2005 in Sudan, followed through by a successor organization called Concordat International, looking at it at a regional level. And then, as Beris was describing, more recently in 2014 with the crisis in Ukraine, looking at that in conjunction with our Russian advisor Valery Morozov, and then at the Korean situation, again invited by Koreans to look at the situation there from a relational perspective and build and follow the methodology we had developed in the context of South Africa, Rwanda and Sudan. Now, it is important that we follow the process so that we invite people on the basis of parity. First of all, we invite people in their individual capacities. We don't put one at a higher seat than the other. They're all sitting equally around the table, equally able to participate, share their views, and their views are not going to be broadcast, but are part of the proceedings, which are commonly held for the process. So we don't have media in the room. It's not recorded, but it's simply taken as a careful exploration of crafted material, which we present very carefully worked through, drawing on the best research which is available from the diversity of standpoints fed into the discussion. So they are all on an equal basis. They all have the same research in front of them. They can all explore together what is required. And then they're able to engage directly with one another. That's another important relational principle. They have continuity in the sense that the process continues over a period of time. There's a series of consultations we have a core group of people, and this can be expanded. The exact membership of the or participation changes slightly, and maybe brought closer to the different protagonists, but there's that continuity over time, and it's looked at systematically in the light of all the different elements, and people get to know people as whole people. They're not just, as it were, protagonists in the room. And finally, there's the common framework which I've described, the relational framework, which transcends the different political positions. So it's done on a strictly non-partisan basis. So these are the principles. This is the methodology we've used typically, and which guides our thinking. Now, it's what we call track 2. It's not track 1, which is negotiation or the movement towards negotiation. It's not track 3, which is at a community level, but it interacts with both. There's a cross-fertilization. It's not threatening, deliberately set up in not to try to take one position against the other, but rather to be in touch with all the people engaged at the highest possible level, and also in touch with what's happening at the community level. So there's that interchange. It's the middle distance, middle level participation, building trust, envisioning a common future. So it's not the only show in town. It cannot be the only show in town. It doesn't try to be the only show in town. It's in touch with all the different groups that are engaged in the process at different levels and in different ways. So it seeks to contribute, as Beris was saying, to the whole as part of the wider economy of peace building. It's an element in the economy of peace building, and I must also say an often missing element in that, because people too quickly rush to the quick agreement and ignore the wider need to build trust over time. The urgency of the situation can precipitate a rush to a quick fix, but the danger of that quick fix is too great that it can simply ignore all the actors, it can ignore the whole range of concerns which need to be brought and carefully worked through at the table. So it's part of the process, it contributes to the process, it provides a key framework, a key scaffolding for the process, which is intended to make it a much more secure and long-lasting achievement of peace.
Jeremy, if I could, just two things. One is to emphasize that bringing people together in the track 2 is not to discuss the current situation and ways out of the current situation, because that introduces the here and now and all of the prejudices and baggage that come with that, but to be envisioning, I think is the word we use, or what would an alternative approach look like with regard to future economic recovery or dealing with various issues that might be top of mind to the group, and they are the ones who identify.
Yes, it's not trying to prescribe, it's simply providing that constructive framework which the participants themselves can work through and develop and take forward. And it is they who are in control of the process, not the Secretariat. The Secretariat is the servant to the process.
With relational research, assisting with the coordination of really best quality research, so that there is an objective analysis tabled for everybody. Second point was that typically government representatives are not in the room. I'm as an ex-government official, because it contaminates the process, to be honest. Even the best intentioned people by obligation are representing their governments. But we certainly do, I think you said, it's not a secret process, it's a confidential process. So we have made sure that in the cases of Ukraine and Korea, for example, that we've informed some of the key governments that this is going on, we've explained what it is we're doing.
Sure.
But on that point, I've got a surprise for everybody, because I've just added another little contribution from Brendan, who's our environmental advisor. But before we go to Brendan, when we're talking about the track 2, and Jeremy's quite right, with some humility, we have to recognize the limitations of our role.
Mm.
And our role really is as channels of hope, to use an expression that will resonate with some of you, to be there creating this space, holding this space secure on the relational principles. But part of our discovery is not only do we have to go in with humility, knowing that as outsiders we don't understand everything that needs to be known about specific situations or contexts. And there are two areas where I think between Valeri and Brendan, we can elaborate on that for you, because one of my blind spots, to speak personally, of course I bring my Western education, my understanding of world history based on what I've been told or what I've discovered, and we're often quick to make judgments about other people's points of view without giving them the benefit of the doubt, being too much influenced by the local media or the attempts by people to misrepresent. And so it's in terms of global politics, where, as all of you would understand, we're in very turbulent times at the moment, and things that we thought were knowns, we're now starting to ask ourselves, do we really know? Where is truth here, and whose point of view should count? So I'm going to ask Valeri just to speak for a few minutes on the work that he's been doing independently, but also very much supporting Relational Peacebuilding Initiative at the global geopolitical level. And at the other end of the spectrum, I'm going to ask Brendan to reflect on the work that he's been doing based on extensive experience at the community level. So I think that will give you the sense of how the whole comes together. Valeri, if I could pass to you, please.
I'll start from what Jeremy said. I think a very important point is that when two sides negotiate or try to find a common ground or solution to the problem, there are two main dangers. First is that they are too quick to get to the agreement, too quick to get to the result, without taking into consideration all the relations which are involved. And on later stage, these relations or these contradictions will come back and ruin the whole process. This is one point. The second point, the second danger, is that the sides don't understand each other correctly, or sometimes at all. And I don't want to be too much in theory. I'll give you two examples. One is example, in Kremlin there is some palace which is called palace, but actually I was surprised that it is called palace. It's just a building near the wall on one of the entrances, and it is occupied by Federal Service of Guards. And there is a third department there, chief of course of the third department, which is responsible for maintenance and construction. So I was working in construction, so I was sometimes coming to this to the room of the commander. And actually it was a study of Stalin. It was in his flat, and that was study. And I was surprised that everything was preserved as it was during Stalin's time. Even the sofa where he spent the night sleeping when Mao Zedong slept in his bed. Because they were too late to discuss, to negotiate. Stalin decided, you stay here, but you occupy my bed, I'll lie here. So chairs, armchairs, bookshelf, everything is there. Nobody dares to change anything. So, and this room was very famous, and the commander told me about this room, and there were different stories, but one story is regarding Churchill. The thing is that Churchill and Stalin, when Churchill came to Moscow during the Second World War, they couldn't get to any agreement. And they were so angry that Churchill was going in his residence and shouting, this crazy Uncle Joe, this and that, and he was told by his advisors, please don't say, we're quite sure that they are, listening, and then they're reporting to him. And he said, yes, I want him to know. He started shouting. Next morning, they were thinking that after this, everything will stop. there is invitation from Stalin to come to his flat. Only to Churchill, and there were two interpreters. One was Gromyko, and the second was, after this he became Minister of Foreign Affairs, and there was interpreter of Churchill, commander, forgotten his name, sorry. So they sat together, two of them, small, there is a desk, small table, big armchairs, very heavy, very difficult to move, and they were sitting and eating and drinking. And they were drinking too much. And for the whole day they were drinking. And Stalin started explaining him his opinion openly, and Churchill. And Stalin said, "You are a liar. How can I believe you? You are a liar. You were promising in 1941 to open the second front. You not opened. In 1942, not. 1943, no. And we are still discussing." And Churchill said, "I've told you that it was, every time I told you it will be difficult." Stalin, "What is difficult?" Difficult, it means yes, but it requires some effort. Do you know who is communist? Communist is the man who overcomes difficulties. And he started saying, and Stalin too, say for example, in 1930s, we decided that agriculture of the Soviet Union should be industrialized. And farmers should be united in big farms, in collective farms. Millions suffered, but we've taken the decision, not me, the whole party, have taken the decision, it should be done because the war is coming. And we've done this industrialization, though millions suffered. So after this, Churchill said, Stalin is a crazy guy. Millions suffered because of crazy decision, some decision to make industrialization of agriculture. And millions suffered. And Stalin said, "Yeah, I don't understand him. He says difficulty doesn't do anything." So this was absolutely different mentality. Because I remember this story when I came to Great Britain. I was to move to another house. I said, "Are you free? Will you vacate the house?" They said, "It will, yes, it will, but no, I think it will be difficult." Difficult. I said, "Okay." By the time I was to move, the house was not was still occupied. I said, "What do you do?" "No, we've told you it will be difficult." What is it? That means no.
You've got 3 minutes for your next story.
So, our next story, yesterday we met with Malcolm Rifkin. You know also Malcolm Rifkin. And we discussed North Korea. And he was saying, "No, we have to press them, they will be revolt, they'll kick out Kim Jong-un." I said, "What is this? Who will kick you? You may say the same thing in 41 that now we'll enter Soviet Union, everybody will revolt, kick out Stalin, communists." Do you remember the result? So, and I told you, do you know that Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-il, yeah? He spoke Russian without language, without any accent. Because he was born in Russia. His father was captain of the Soviet army, Spetsnaz, prepared to fight on the territory occupied by Japan in China. So that was the rise of this family. And he married a Russian, a woman. And Kim Jong-il was born in Russia. His name was Yuri Kim. In reality. Do you know this? No, I don't know. He came to Moscow. Putin invited him. He lived in Kremlin. And I knew commander of Grand Kremlin Palace where he lived, and he is commander of the residence of the president, Mr. Demin. And Demin told me this story. Because he spoke Russian, there were different stories. They became very close because he was asking something. Demin was doing this, different things. After we are released, if anybody interested, I will tell the stories. But one story I'll tell. They were going from the place where he lived, bedroom, to some meeting. And they were going through Grand Kremlin Palace. There were a lot of corridors. And he was allowed, Kim Jong-il, to have his bodyguards. And in all this Grand Kremlin Palace, in all corridors, there were his bodyguards. And Devin was alone because usually bodyguards, they are only outside if there is no president there or something. So he was accompanying him, and they were going through one of the corridors. And because Kim Jong-il had a lot of bodyguards, there were some women bodyguards also. Most of them, they've not seen him closely. They've seen him somewhere, maybe they were, not, it is called not close circle. So there's one of the girls, the bodyguards, was standing in the corridor, and they were passing. And suddenly, she saw Kim Jong-il passing by very close to her, and she collapsed. I asked Malcolm Rifkin, can you imagine a bodyguard of Theresa May, when she comes close to him, he collapses because he's so impressed. Or Trump's bodyguard or Putin. No, this is different mentality of different people. And the second story also about Korea will be, the thing is that in Korea, in North Korea, military people are higher than civil. And there was a delegation going from Russia to North Korea. Большой theater, different. So the leader of the delegation was appointed a general. And this general was commander of Kremlin, Mr. Strygin, Sergei Vasilyevich Strygin. So when he came, and after some time he called me, he said, Valery, I'm invited to the dinner by one of the richest South Korean businessmen. Can you come with me? I said, oh, why? I said, no, like interpreter. I said, okay. So I went with him. He was going with his deputy, and me, three of us. And he said, I asked you because, it's not very good for us. He's asking us for the dinner. Commander of Kremlin, strange. I went to the head of the Federal Service of Guards, and he said, okay, you go, but you take your deputy and somebody from outside the service as a witness that nothing wrong is going on. So I have invited you. I said, okay. So we went there, and we were sitting and discussing and in one of the restaurants in Moscow. And time was passing, and at the end of the dinner, Strygin told me, please ask him, what is the purpose of the meeting? I have to tell something in Kremlin. They said, well, why? And I can't understand. So I asked South Korean businessman, what was the purpose? And he said, the thing is that I know that Mr. Strygin has been to North Korea. I said, yes. And I know that he was taking photographs with Kim Jong-il. Yes. Can he give me some photographs? I told Strygin, why? The thing is that, of course, we are different countries, and we are different, everything, and we are, policy is different. But for us, because we have one mentality and traditional thinking, in Russian it is chukhe or chukhe, and they are preserving it in Korean way. This family are like semi-gods for us, and we keep in very specific areas at home, we keep their photographs. But we can get in South Korea only few of them. And we know that Strygin has very different photographs. Can he give it to me? I said, what are you discussing? How you can press? And what will be the result of the unification? You should look from different angles. You should know what you are speaking about, and what you are discussing, and what you are constructing the policy.
Thank you very much, Valery. I think these are very interesting stories, well told.
I just add one thing.
Quickly.
That's why we have an idea, and we are working now on setting up, and it is very much supported, by the way, in Russia, because people start understanding, and also I feel the support in the West to set up joint structures like analytical and information centers to bring this understanding between people, to rewrite the history, not as BBC tells. Fake news now is I was in charge of information warfare in Russia.
One minute.
And you know, I can assure you, in the worst years of the Cold War and information warfare, there was no chance, even one chance, to think about that I or anybody else in Soviet Union or anybody in the United States or in United Kingdom, will change the words of the world leaders. It is not possible. It was not possible. So nobody will dare to change the words of Reagan or to change the words of Brezhnev. And people will be immediately kicked out if they do by mistake. And only now you can see on TV or any CNN when Putin, say, for example, says that we ask or approach to all the sides to stop shooting. And translation is, Putin promised to stop shooting. These are different things.
Right. Let's leave it there. Thank you, Valerie. I think there are some really interesting pointers there which show us, even in our attention to those stories, how we communicate in different ways and how we make assumptions about what the other person might be thinking. So I'm glad that you were able to contribute.
Within a short period of time.
Very short, very short. But it's more than Brendan's going to get. So Brendan, over to you. And you're going to tie it all together for us before we have some time for discussion.
Instead of 3 stories, 1.
Oh, we're going to need some peace building here in a minute.
So Brendan is going to say yes, but difficult.
So I think Valerie has shown the importance of stories and relationships in peace building better than could possibly have done with any PowerPoints. I think another thing which comes out of what Valerie was saying is culture and how fundamental to an understanding of peace building is the interrelationship, well, the interaction between a relationship and culture. Okay, question. Which comes first? Do we relate as a result of our culture setting norms which determine our relationship? Or do we have relationships which hold culture and therefore determine the nature of the society we live in? So I would suggest that that is a chicken and egg question, and I would suggest that is a fundamental question to peace building, because just by way of introduction, I'm doing a PhD at the moment. I did 9 years of work on peace building in Sudan, and so it works in practice. My PhD is, does it work in theory? You see the distinction. So that's why I have a theoretical perspective now on some of these questions. And if you'll give me just 1 minute on theory. So in terms of culture and in terms of solidarity in culture, we are a community. We have solidarity on the basis of reciprocity. We've all given up some opportunity to do something ourselves on the basis of you have also given up something, and we have a solidarity. And I generally use, we've got a multicultural audience, but I use an English example for this. As English, if there's a shortage of something, we'll join a queue. Now, by doing that, we know it's just one of the rules of being English. You join queues at every available opportunity. But one thing we know is that all other English people will also join the queue. So this unwritten rule of our culture indicates our solidarity, how we behave, and our identity. Okay? So then when you have a situation in conflict, my case study is the Darfur conflict, where you've got a society that the unwritten rules, or indeed the written rules, fall apart, then you've got your social, we call this a social institution. This idea of Englishness is social institutions, many overlapping social institutions. But the institution has broken down in some contexts. So in the war in Darfur has 2 very important types of solidarity. One is the solidarity that we are working together as farmers or as herders, and we have an identity based on our livelihood. Now that is an inclusive identity because if we're working together on our livelihood, I play down our ethnic differences. I will try and guess your language and speak. If I think you're Arab, I'll project an Arab, just so that we get on and we can do a deal. Okay, that's what happens in peacetime, and there's examples of that a lot in the 60s and so on, that some people would transfer from one tribe to another in Darfur because they wanted to kind of become not a farmer but a herder. So, but then in conflict you find that, well, blood money is paid by the tribe, the militia is raised on a tribal basis. So actually, I may have been making out that I want to spend a lot of time with my Arab friend here, but actually if my tribe has committed a murder, then I will have to pay for this person. And you find that in conflict, it hardens towards ethnicity. So it's very interesting in contexts of conflict how different identities form. And we've seen it terribly in my own country. By my own country, what do I mean? Do I mean England? Do I mean Britain? I've got Scottish ancestry, and at that time of the referendum, whether Scotland should become independent, there was a definite hardening of identities of Scottishness or not Scottishness. Now, I feel very European. I'm appalled by Brexit. So I'm shifting these different levels of identity. Now, once we understand these areas of solidarity, then my question, the question my research is looking at, is about how this chicken and egg question of relationships and culture. Because, for example, the kind of work I did when I worked with the UN in Sudan is that we found that the Western narrative on the Darfur conflict was very simplistic in pitting the Arabs against the non-Arabs. And actually, when you talked in terms of the camel herders, their livelihood was really suffering. And we had to break out of this Arab, non-Arab conflict solidarities to looking at, okay, what is the future for camel herding? And the way we did this is we did some joint research projects with people from the camel herding side, sometimes working very much with political people connected with, one guy had been involved with the violence within the government action on behalf of this community. And then at the end of the day, there was these different groups ended up doing this research project together, and by exploring how a new narrative about the economic livelihoods of the pastoralists, they could then contribute something to a peace process. Or in another case, we took groups from all sides of the conflict to South Africa to find how the South African water sector was reformed in the post-apartheid era. And then they came back. And the term for this is looking at how these things of culture morph, they change over time. You don't jump to a new culture, you recycle bits of other culture. And this is called institutional bricolage. In term, bricolage is the French for DIY. And so we found that collaboration over water, there's a project going on now in Darfur, which is based on the South African model that has been Sudanized, and different parts of the Darfuri community are working with it. And so, just to kind of say, what do I mean by bricolage, just to close it up, no more stories, is, again, as English, I can say in conversation I was completely stumped. Now, that means something to share my institutional knowledge of cricket. It means nothing to people who don't know the institution of cricket. But what I've done is I've borrowed from one institution and brought it in here. And I think all of society works with these borrowing of different behaviours. And I think that if you can build a relationship Well, it can be a prototype for a new form of institution, and it can contribute to this process of institutional bricolage.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Brendan. I think this brings us very neatly back to Jeremy, who's now in the hot seat, because it is this interplay between relationship or relationships and culture that is the underpinning of a peace-building process, and the interplays that we've discovered, listening more, understanding more, not making so many assumptions as we do. So the relational peace-building approach is in this space, as many others of you are, who are also involved in various kinds of peace-building and trust and confidence building. So we're going to open it up. We've got 15 minutes left before we dash back across to the other side for the final session. So please, any comments or sharing of experience or suggestions?
I'll make a comment.
Please.
I suppose there's an answer to this, but when you come at this exercise, track 2 as you call it, and I think you say you're not addressing the immediate conflict, but you're looking forward to a stage beyond that. We would inevitably, or if I was involved in this, I'd inevitably come it with a strong feeling about the rule of law, which as a lawyer I feel extremely strongly about, the right of people to be defended if they're accused of a criminal offence, the right to have a lawyer, etc., respect for the courts. I'd also come about it with a feeling of support for the poor and needy. I'd want that in an ideal society. I'd also come inevitably with a feeling that there should be a democratic vote for leaders. And obviously I realise that you don't try and have that in mind or impose it on a society, but you've got to clear your mind of all that, haven't you? Because a lot of countries would operate very successfully without having a democratic vote for leaders, and one of the mistakes I think we've made in international affairs is trying to impose that on other countries because we think that's the right way of operating, and they simply don't operate that way. Their society works well, but in a different model. So you have to clear your mind of everything, do you? And try and look at it from the other people's perspective.
There are 4 of us here, and I think we've probably got 33 opinions.
Oh, good.
I'm going to ask Jeremy.
I'm glad it is I thought it was a straightforward answer, so that's good. Good.
Jeremy, what's your response to that question?
First of all, I think that, yes, there are 2 things. One is peace building is not the same thing as advocacy. Advocacy is taking an issue, and for example, a good example of this would be Amnesty International, and campaigning,
yep.
bringing out adverts against the use of the death penalty here, or whatever the case might be. Peace building needs to engage with the protagonists, and so it cannot be engaged in that sort of confrontation. But at the same time, it's not simply a blank sheet, because there are still basic principles which need to be built into the process, not in order to wag fingers at anybody, but rather to provide, as it were, a boundary to encircle the discussion.
Oh, I see. Yep.
So we're not talking about, for instance, the importance of the rule of law. That would be something which would indeed be accepted as implicit in the process.
Oh, I see.
Yes, and yes, okay. Clearly, in cases that we might be talking about, there's severe breaches of that. But the point is not to try and focus on those breaches, but rather to focus on what the future would be like. And so you want a future, so obviously you don't want you want a future with the rule of law. You want a future which would encourage the greatest participation in the political process, fairness for all, etc. So those are built into the future assumptions, but not as an advocacy position, not as ammunition to, as it were, use or to supply any protagonists against the other with.
Jeremy, I'm going to ask Brendan to speak on this issue.
So, I think it entirely depends on context, and I think particularly important at the higher levels to have more focus on that. But what you find is that people either engage in their legal process tactically or strategically. So, and there's some very interesting relational contract theory based on the legal side of relational contracts, which look at how do people involved in peacekeeping processes engage in these very structured things. But just to say, in the context I was working in Darfur, is Darfur has a hybrid between customary leadership and rule of law in the courts, and actually across Africa, across the world, things are hybrid.
Yeah.
With places like, our customary law and traditional leadership has changed quite radically in my own lifetime on the getting rid of hereditary peers and the changes of access to common land, open access. Canada's is changing very considerably. Everywhere these interface between customary law and statutory law is dynamic. And so in Darfur, I was much more interested in a process of bricolage by understanding how, and actually across Africa, people want, at the moment, there's a trajectory to more customary law and less statutory law, and particularly in natural resource governance rather than in some other areas of law. So therefore, what I wanted to enable in Darfur was a genuine discussion, a genuine informed process of how are Darfuris going to re-establish governance of natural resources with what blend of statutory law and customary law.
I think that's really helpful. I'll just come to you in a moment. Let me just say, my immediate reaction was that there is no such thing as value-free engagement. No one can claim that. Because even the communist has a point of view, the capitalist, the socialist, people who declare themselves to be a-religious bring that perspective and so on. And there are global norms often observed in the breach through international regulation, human rights law and what have you. But jumping to your comment, Jonathan, I think we sometimes in the so-called West romance the notion of rule of law, forgetting that rule of law works for the powerful first and foremost. Hard law is typically economic, punitive law. Soft law is about development and social goods and preventing discrimination. So we have lots of declarations at that end, but nothing we can actually enforce. And the last thing I wanted to just insert is that we often also make rather moralistic assumptions about value-free zones. And NGOs do this a lot, assuming that private sector people, they're just awful people, they're only interested in profit. But private sector people also have value systems. People living in Russia also have value systems. And so it is really, again, bringing us back to, if we are not relational ourselves, how will we promote relational peace building? So if we
I just need to plug something.
Sorry, yes, plug. 30 seconds.
Before you put your notebooks away, do a Google search for UNEP, UNEP, relationships and resources, and then you'll find
excellent report.
Sorry, UNEP, what is it?
UNEP is the UN Environment Programme.
UNEP.
UNEP, and then the title of the report is Relationships and Resources. And if you add Sudan, then you'll get a report which uses relational thinking as an indicator for peace building.
Very good report. I'm pushing it as much as I can.
So I'd like to get just one. Is there another question or comment?
Yeah, I
Please,
have a
Julie, and then we'll come back to Valerie.
I have a question, maybe for Brendan. You talk about the cultural interaction often being an important plane of engagement. I was wondering, when you your process of bricolage, is it a clumsy process?
Very.
Or do you use another way of...
Very clumsy.
Okay.
But the most wonderful example is the Magna Carta.
Yeah.
So the Magna Carta is a relationship between the king and the barons made in a peace agreement. So they resolved an argument, and there are people in this room better placed than I to explain the significance of that relationship culturally in the 1,000 years since then. But if you didn't want that example, another example would be any marriage as the basis of family. So just time and again, you find a story of a relationship and brings a change to culture of the community affected by that relationship. And that to me is fundamental link between peace building and cultural change.
Okay, so you use the story that is inherent within the context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Valérie?
I just want to make one remark. You know, when you speak about rule of law and democracy, in the West, very frequently you mean the democracy and the rule of law, what you accept or you understand, which has nothing, sometimes very little to do with understanding of the rule of law and democracy in other countries.
That's my point.
Yes.
Yes.
So, for example, in 16th century, you're on the table, Russian Tsar, and his very closest friend, Kurbsky, who betrayed him and went to Poland. They exchanged letters. And the meaning was, the conflict was, that Kurbsky was promoting Western ideas of democracy. And Johann the Terrible explains that you are selfish and you can't, if I accept your ideas, I'll ruin Russia. And he supported that was called a symphony, which was inherited from Byzantine by Russia, which has come as Tsarism. That means there is a ruler who are controlled by moral values and church. But this ruler makes the laws and changes the laws. If he understands that this is to be done in this particular moment to save this unity of huge country, because of 100 nationalities, 100 this and that, and so that. And you have Ukraine, which you also don't understand, because they have their own understanding of democracy, which is called Volnitsa. But Volnitsa is difference between democracy in the West and Volnitsa. What you'll see, or you can't see now, BBC is not covering this, but if you go into the internet, you'll see what is going on in Ukraine. And they will say that this is democracy. But you'll never think that this is democracy and rule of law. But why? Because Cossacks area, for many centuries, without any rule, they've set up their own democracy, Volnitsa. What does it mean? If we gather together now in this room and decide something for ourselves, it becomes the law for us. And we are to fulfill this law, but not law in St. Catherine College. If we tomorrow decide with Jeremy that we'll go against this rule, and we'll accept this and decide, we'll go, and it will be democracy. So we are, in Ukraine, they are ready to change. Today they are for Europe and Trump. Tomorrow they'll change it, and they'll think that they are correct, because this is democracy. And you'll never change it, because I know these people, and they don't understand anything else. That's why they can't make the state.
And we will see that as the capriciousness rather than recognize the cultural phenomenon that underpins it. I'm going to exercise another cultural phenomenon, which is Swiss timekeeping. I'm not Swiss, I'm Australian, so there we are. But we need to be back in the other cell for the 4 o'clock closing session. So thank you very much, Jeremy, Valérie, Brendan. Thank you all for coming.